Welcome, mystery lovers. In this story, we step into the world of Tommy and Tuppence, a pair whose wit and courage have made them unforgettable. Tell us where in the world you're listening from. It's always a joy to see how far these mysteries travel. If you enjoy these mysteries, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps keep new cases coming. Now then, shall we begin? The trouble with being married to a professional adventurer, Tuppence Beresford reflected, was that adventure had an inconvenient habit of continuing without one. The London flat at South Audley Mansions was too quiet these days. Tommy was off somewhere involving briefcases, officials, and what he described, rather vaguely, as foreign coordination. That usually meant a place with bad coffee and a high likelihood of danger. Tuppence, left to her own devices, had taken to the domestic arts with all the enthusiasm of a cat forced into a bath. She was halfway through reorganizing the sideboard, a battlefield of letters, cigarette cards, and unposted bills, when Albert, their ex-office boy turned household factotum, poked his head round the door. "You at it again, Mrs. B?" he asked cheerfully. Tommy's filing system never did deserve the name. "I'm only preventing future tragedy," she said. "Someone has to keep this household from being declared an archaeological site." Albert grinned. "You'll find the Dead Sea Scrolls in that top drawer if you keep digging." She waved a half-duster at him. "Go and put the kettle on before I discover the Ark of the Covenant as well." Albert vanished, humming something tuneless. The momentary warmth of his presence receded, leaving Tuppence with the ticking of the mantel clock and the faint hum of London beyond the curtained windows. The air smelled faintly of polish and burnt toast, signs of Albert's morning heroics in the kitchen. She sorted another handful of envelopes, most addressed in Tommy's unmistakable scrawl. Receipts, reports, a subscription to Punch. Nothing thrilling. Then her fingers stopped on one envelope that did not belong. It was cream-coloured, expensive, and bore a faint scent of salt. The handwriting was delicate but hurried, the postmark blurred but legible. Seaford in Kent. Something in that name tugged at memory. She slit the envelope open, expecting perhaps a bill or an advertisement for a seaside pension. But there was only one sheet inside, folded once and written in trembling black ink. "Please come. You were right. She's alive. No signature, no address, only those 5 words." For a long moment, she simply stared at it, the clock marking time like a small hammer. "She's alive." The phrase swam up like a ghost from deep water. It was absurdly melodramatic, and yet her pulse quickened. Tommy's world had always been littered with mysterious pronouns. She, they, the contact. He'd once said that most secrets began with the vaguest of sentences, but this wasn't his letter. It had come to their home, and there was no reason on earth why anyone in Seaford should write to her. Albert returned carrying a teapot that gurgled reproachfully. "Tea's on," he announced. "Find anything worth keeping?" Tuppence looked up absently. "Only this. What do you make of it?" He took the letter gingerly as if it might explode. "Please come. You were right. She's alive." Sounds like something out of a penny thriller. Exactly, but thrillers have to begin somewhere. She took it back, smoothing the paper. "Albert, do you recall if we ever had a case near Seaford?" He frowned. "Not that I know of. There was that business with the smuggler's yacht off Brighton, but that was miles along the coast." "Yes, and Tommy's idea of sea travel involves a bath and a towel." She tapped the paper against her chin. "Whoever wrote this clearly meant it for us. The question is, which of us, and about whom?" Albert eyed her with suspicion. "You're not thinking of going, are you?" "My dear boy, what else can one do? We can't have mysterious women returning from the dead without so much as a how do you do." "That's just it. We can't. But seeing as he's not back yet..." She smiled, folding the letter neatly into her handbag. "Then it's up to me, isn't it?" Albert groaned. "You'll get us all on the front page of the Mirror." "I should be delighted. It's been ages since they published a flattering photo." "Tommy'll have a fit when he hears." "Then it's fortunate he won't hear until I've solved the mystery," she said briskly, heading toward the hall. Albert followed helplessly. "At least wait till tomorrow. Give me time to pack sandwiches or a rope or something." "No need for ropes. This isn't a mountain expedition, just a village call. Seaford in Kent." She paused, repeating the words with the thoughtful air of a woman tasting an unfamiliar recipe. "I'll take the noon train." Albert stuffed his hands into his pockets. Right. I'll tell the police where to send the search party. She gave him a look of amused exasperation. You're a pessimist. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? Albert's eyebrows rose. You've said that before, Mrs. B. She laughed softly and went back to the sitting room. The letter lay on the desk, pale against the mahogany surface. She felt the old spark of excitement kindling, the feeling she hadn't known since their earlier cases, when the world had seemed one large crossword waiting to be solved. She poured herself a cup of tea. The steam fogged her glasses, and through it she saw the reflection of her own face, older than the girl who had once chased spies through country lanes but still eager for the next riddle. The mantel clock chimed the quarter hour. Outside, a milk cart rattled by, the driver whistling. Life, steady and complacent, went on. Yet in her mind those words pulsed with life. She's alive. She took a sheet of notepaper and jotted a few lines to Tommy. Nothing that would alarm him, merely that she was visiting a friend by the sea and would write again soon. She hesitated before signing it, then smiled wryly. Your wife, behaving sensibly for once, she murmured. As she sealed the note, a draught rustled through the curtains. The letter from Seaford fluttered to the floor, landing face up. She bent to pick it up, but for a second she thought she heard something, a faint echo from the street below. A voice? Or only her imagination dressing the ordinary in drama again? Still, she went to the window and looked down. The pavement was empty except for a boy delivering papers. But there had been movement, she was sure, a shadow slipping round the corner. Someone had been watching the building. Don't be absurd, she told herself. You're seeing ghosts before breakfast. Yet her hand lingered on the curtain longer than it should have. Albert's voice called from the kitchen. Train's at 12:20. Want me to ring up for a ticket? Thank you, Albert, but I think I'll buy it myself, she said. A woman should manage her own adventures. He poked his head out again, frowning. Just promise me one thing. No disguises, no code names, and no running off cliffs. I make no promises of that kind, said Tuppence lightly. They spoil the fun. By mid-morning she was dressed in her travelling suit, navy blue with a smart felt hat, and fastening her gloves. She paused to glance once more around the tidy sitting room. The flowers on the mantel were fresh, the clock dependable as ever, and the faint scent of Albert's overbrewed tea clung to the air. Everything in its place, everything calm. She slipped the letter into her handbag, shut the clasp firmly and smiled. Well, my mysterious correspondent, she said under her breath, let's see what you're hiding by the sea. As she left the flat, the hallway light flickered once, then steadied. Downstairs, the porter tipped his cap. Off for the day, Mrs. Beresford? For a little excursion, she replied. One never knows what one might find. She stepped into the brisk London air, her heels tapping with purpose. Somewhere, far from the comfort of the city, a story had already begun without her. And if there was one thing Tuppence Beresford couldn't resist, it was a story that refused to explain itself. The 12:20 from Charing Cross rattled into Seaford in Kent with the air of a train that had seen better days and resented every mile of its current existence. Tuppence Beresford, however, stepped down from the carriage as though she were disembarking from the Orient Express. She adjusted her hat, squared her shoulders, and surveyed the platform with the keen eye of a woman determined to find adventure, even if the only available suspects were luggage porters and seagulls. The air had a different taste here, salt and iron, with something faintly medicinal about it. Beyond the station gates, the village stretched out in tidy rows of cottages and slate roofs, all too neat to be innocent. A seaside breeze tugged at her veil as she made her way past a line of shops with prim window displays, a grocer's boasting best pickled herrings, a milliner's with hats that could have belonged to another decade, and a tea-room whose proprietor eyed Tuppence's city suit with suspicion. She smiled to herself. A closed community, she murmured, perfect breeding ground for gossip and murder. The sign for the Blue Gull Inn swung above a low white building with blue shutters. The carved gull on the sign looked as though it had seen too much and trusted no one. Inside, the air smelled of furniture polish and coastal damp, laced with the faint sweetness of scones just removed from the oven. A plump woman in a floral dress emerged from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good afternoon, dearie. You'll be wanting a room?" "I should, if one's available," said Tuppence. "Mrs. Beresford, travelling from London." "Mrs. Cattermole," the woman said. beaming as though she'd been waiting for exactly that introduction all week. "We don't get many from London this time of year. Bit quiet, but it's a good quiet." "I adore quiet," Tuppence lied. Mrs. Catamole led her up a narrow staircase, chattering all the way. "We had the bank manager and his wife from Hastings last month. Nice enough, though he snored like the Channel steamer. Your room's got a view of the sea, mind, though some folks find it too much company at night. Says it sounds like whispering, the way the tide hits the stones." "I've always thought the sea's voice comforting," said Tuppence. "Comfort's a matter of what you expect, dear." Mrs. Catamole smiled, but her eyes darted to the window as if to make sure the ocean hadn't overheard. The room was small but neat. Patchwork quilt, mahogany washstand, lace curtains that fluttered with the salt wind. Tuppence set down her suitcase, taking in the faint creak of floorboards and the distant boom of waves below the cliffs. It was, she decided, an excellent place for secrets. Downstairs, she found the inn's sitting room, dimly lit and lined with old naval prints. A maid was polishing the brass doorknob with more focus than enthusiasm. She was a slim girl of about 20, with pale hair pinned under a cap and the wary eyes of someone who had learned that silence was a safer currency than talk. "Good morning," Tuppence said lightly. "Or is it afternoon already?" "Afternoon, ma'am," the girl replied. "You're local, I suppose?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you'll know everyone worth knowing in Seaford." The girl hesitated, glancing toward the hallway. "Most, ma'am." Tuppence smiled. An admirable answer. She let the conversation drift no further. Better to let the girl come to her later, as such girls invariably did, with the right scrap of gossip at the right moment. Mrs. Catamole soon reappeared with tea and gossip enough to fill a newspaper. "You mustn't mind Elsie," she said, nodding toward the retreating maid. "She's a good girl, just a bit peculiar. Worked up the road once at the big house, Mrs. North's." "Mrs. North?" The landlady's eyebrows twitched. "Lives up on the cliff path. Poor soul, she keeps herself to herself now. Lost her sister some years back. Tragic boating thing. Never got over it." Tuppence poured herself a cup, feigning mild curiosity. "How sad. And yet you say she stays on in that great house all alone." "Well, there's staff of sorts. A gardener, a charwoman, and a companion who doesn't last long. Folks say the place is too draughty for comfort." Mrs. Catamole lowered her voice. "And there's talk, you know. Odd noises. Lights late at night. Some say she hears the sea talking back." Tuppence stirred her tea. "Really? How fascinating." "Fascinating? I'd call it unnatural." The landlady reached for the sugar bowl, still talking, but when Tuppence, with deliberate casualness, mentioned that she had come to Seaford because of a letter, everything stopped. Mrs. Catamole froze mid-pour. The teapot tilted, spilling amber liquid across the tray. The sound seemed very loud in the small room. "A letter, you said?" she asked, her voice suddenly thin. "Yes, quite mysterious. No signature, only that someone here might be alive when thought otherwise." Mrs. Catamole's complexion paled. "You'll excuse me, dearie. I'd best see to the kettle." She hurried off, leaving behind the faint smell of scorched tea leaves and unease. Tuppence watched her go, thoughtful. She sipped the lukewarm tea and smiled to herself. The reaction had been genuine and frightened. When she rose to fetch her coat, Elsie appeared again, holding a folded cloth. "Beg pardon, ma'am. Mrs. Catamole asked me to change the tray cloth." Tuppence glanced at the girl's trembling hands. "Do you know Mrs. North well, Elsie?" The maid hesitated, then whispered, "I used to, ma'am. Best not to talk about her. The sea keeps its own." Before Tuppence could press further, the girl fled, leaving behind a damp scent of lavender soap and fear. The afternoon waned into a pale gold that flattered the village into charm. Tuppence decided to walk before dinner, notebook tucked into her handbag. The promenade was nearly deserted. Shops were shuttering, gulls wheeled above the harbour, shrieking like gossips denied an audience. She wandered past a line of fishermen mending nets and a dog barking at nothing in particular. The air was sharp, and the sea below whispered against the pebbles, a sound less like music and more like breathing. Halfway along the promenade she paused, glancing back. A man in a dark coat had been following her, or so she thought. He stopped when she did, then turned abruptly into a side lane. Tuppence frowned. She wasn't frightened, not yet, but her instinct told her this village had more eyes than faces. She sat briefly on a bench overlooking the shore. From this vantage point she could see, high above the cliffs, a single house silhouetted against the fading light. Its windows caught the sunset like dull coins, and though the distance made it impossible to discern movement, she had the uncanny impression of someone standing there, watching. She took out her notebook, scribbling, "Mrs. North, widow, sister drowned, cliff house, everyone evasive, possible connection to letter." A shadow flickered over the page as the first evening gull swept low. She closed the notebook and rose. Time to return before the village drew its curtains and decided to forget her entirely. As she made her way back through the narrow streets, lamps began to glow in cottage windows, each small square of light a reminder that she was the outsider looking in. Conversations hushed as she passed. A man at the post office pretended not to see her. The sense of being politely ignored had sharpened into something colder, a village-wide conspiracy of silence. When she reached the Blue Gull, Mrs. Catamole was waiting in the doorway, her smile too bright. "Out for your stroll, were you? The air's bracing, isn't it?" "Bracing enough to make a Londoner suspicious," Tuppence replied cheerfully. Mrs. Catamole laughed, but her eyes darted to the stairs. "You'll find hot water in your jug. Supper's at 7 sharp." "Excellent. I've an appetite, and a few questions yet." The landlady's hands twitched on her apron. "Questions are best left to the police, dearie. This isn't a place for excitement." "On the contrary," said Tuppence, moving past her toward the staircase, "I'm beginning to think it's precisely that." She reached her room and closed the door. The sound of the latch sliding home was comforting. Outside, the sea continued its whispering below the cliffs, and through the lace curtains she could just see the light from Mrs. North's house, one single lamp shining steadily against the dusk, like an eye that never closed. Tuppence stood there a long moment, the salt air brushing her face, and thought again of the letter. "Please come. You were right. She's alive." The village might pretend not to notice, but Tuppence Beresford had already decided it was hiding something worth finding. The next morning began with the kind of deceptive cheer that always precedes trouble. Sunshine lay on the cobbles, the gulls were indignant as usual, and Mrs. Catamole's breakfast tray arrived with a conspiratorial clatter of teacups and bacon. Tuppence, in a crisp linen blouse and her most purposeful hat, buttered her toast with the air of a general preparing for a campaign. "Mrs. Catamole," she said brightly, "would you happen to know the path that leads up to Mrs. North's house?" The landlady froze mid-motion, her cheerful manner slipping. "Up the cliff road, dearie, but there's nothing to see there, just a big old house falling into the sea." "How thrilling. I have a weakness for architectural tragedy." Mrs. Catamole tutted. "She doesn't take callers." "Then she'll appreciate the novelty," Tuppence said, finishing her tea. 5 minutes later she was out the door, her stride brisk and her curiosity sharper than the morning wind. The village fell away behind her, replaced by hedgerows and the distant murmur of the tide. A narrow path wound upward between gorse bushes and weathered stones until it reached a set of iron gates that once might have been grand. Now they sagged slightly, flecked with rust, as though they too had grown weary of guarding secrets. Beyond them stood Cliff House. The name suited it, a tall, pale structure poised dangerously near the edge of the headland, its windows catching the light like watchful eyes. The garden was overgrown yet strangely tended. Roses bloomed in disciplined lines, though weeds crept between the paving stones. Somewhere a bell tolled from the church in the village below, and the sound seemed to hang in the air like a warning. Tuppence pressed the gate latch. It creaked, naturally. All gates in such houses creak, and she followed the gravel path toward the front door. It opened before she could knock. A woman stood there, not Mrs. North, but a housekeeper by the look of her, middle-aged and built like a fortress in an apron. "Yes, madam?" "I wonder if I might speak with Mrs. North," said Tuppence with her best tone of innocent inquiry. "I'm researching local history for a magazine piece, particularly the architecture along this coast." The woman looked unimpressed. "Mrs. North doesn't receive visitors." "Oh, how disappointing. I'd so hoped to include the view from her terrace. They say it's remarkable." From somewhere deeper in the house came a voice, soft, cultured, and faintly weary. "Who is it, Mrs. Webb?" The housekeeper turned reluctantly. "A lady asking about the house, ma'am." "Let her come in," the voice said. Mrs. Webb stepped aside with the air of someone indulging a bad idea. "This way, madam." Tuppence entered, and the air changed. It smelled faintly of lavender, sea air, and something metallic, like an old key left too long in a lock. The hallway was dim, lined with oil portraits whose eyes followed her with practised suspicion. At the end stood Mrs. North. She was not what Tuppence had expected. Dressed in grey silk, tall and fine-boned, she might have been beautiful once, but her beauty had retreated behind fatigue. Her hair was silvering at the temples, her expression controlled, her posture as straight as a blade. "I must apologise for intruding," said Tuppence, "but I couldn't resist seeing the house. It has such character." "Character," Mrs. North repeated. Her voice carried the faintest trace of irony. "That's one word for it. Please, sit down." The drawing-room was elegant but subdued, furniture polished to a dull glow, curtains half drawn against the sea glare. On the mantel stood a row of framed photographs. One in particular caught Tuppence's attention, a young woman in a summer dress, smiling as though unaware the world could ever darken. She knew that face. The same photograph had once lain on Tommy's desk years ago, during a case involving a vanished heiress and a yacht explosion off Brighton. Margaret Dane, the girl had been called, presumed drowned, her fiancé ruined, the affair quietly hushed up. But here she was, staring out from Mrs. North's mantelpiece. Tuppence schooled her features into mild admiration. "What a lovely picture! A relative?" Mrs. North's eyes flicked toward it, then away. "My sister. She died many years ago." There was finality in her tone, the kind that begged no reply. Tuppence, of course, made one anyway. "I'm so sorry. It must be strange living here by the sea after such a loss." "Strange," Mrs. North said softly, "is one word for it." Tuppence hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "Forgive my curiosity, but did she drown nearby?" For a heartbeat, silence. Then the widow rose, smoothing her skirt. "I'm afraid I have other matters to attend to, Mrs. "Beresford," said Tuppence. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Mrs. North's composure faltered. "Beresford?" she repeated. "Are you related to—" "To the Beresfords of London, yes," said Tuppence quickly, offering a smile too bright to be innocent. "My husband and I once helped with a matter on the coast. Quite a coincidence, really." Mrs. North's fingers tightened on the back of the chair. "Coincidences are rarely harmless, Mrs. Beresford. Good day." Dismissal unmistakable. Tuppence rose smoothly. "Of course. Thank you for indulging my intrusion." Mrs. North inclined her head, but her expression remained taut. "Webb will show you out." The housekeeper appeared instantly, as though summoned by thought. Tuppence followed her down the hall, her senses alive to every sound, the faint hum of a clock, the creak of floorboards above. Somewhere overhead a door closed softly, not by the wind. At the threshold, Mrs. Webb hesitated. "Best not come again, madam. The mistress don't need reminders of the past." Tuppence smiled pleasantly. "I'll remember that advice, Mrs. Webb, though the past has a habit of visiting uninvited, doesn't it?" The woman gave no answer. Outside, the brightness hit her like a slap. The air smelled sharply of roses, though she saw only a few blooming along the terrace. As she descended the path toward the gate, she turned once more to glance up at the house. A curtain in the upper window moved, not the casual flutter of wind, but a deliberate parting, a human hand drawing it aside. For a moment she saw nothing. Then, just as she looked away, something small drifted down, a single rose petal, pale and perfect, spinning lazily until it came to rest on the gravel at her feet. She bent to pick it up. The petal was fresh, faintly scented, a small token of beauty fallen from height. She tucked it into her notebook, more as instinct than decision. Behind her, the sound of the sea rose and fell, steady as breathing. The house loomed above, serene in daylight, but carrying the unease of a place that had witnessed too much and spoken too little. Tuppence lingered at the gate, considering. The photograph, the reaction to her name, the warning in Mrs. Cattermole's eyes, all threads in a web she could feel tightening around something hidden. "Well," she said aloud to the waiting sea, "if you wanted to frighten me, my dear Mrs. North, you'll have to do better than good manners and roses." The gulls answered her with derisive cries as she turned toward the path. Halfway down the slope, she encountered an elderly man trimming hedges near the lane. He touched his cap politely. "Morning, miss. You've been up to the North Place, then?" "Just admiring the view," Tuppence said lightly. "Do you know her well?" "Used to, before she kept to herself. They say she's never been the same since her sister drowned. Terrible business. Boat went up like fireworks. Some say the body was never found." "Never found?" he shrugged. "Sea keeps its own, they say." Tuppence smiled faintly. "Yes, I've heard that." As she walked on, the man's words echoed in her mind. Never found. And that photograph, alive, vibrant, unburied. At the edge of the lane, she stopped to look back once more. The house stood aloof against the sky, its windows glinting like distant eyes. For a moment she fancied she saw movement again, a figure withdrawing from the upstairs window, quick and furtive. Then the light shifted, and the illusion vanished. She exhaled, half laughing at herself. "You're imagining things, Tuppence, or worse, enjoying them." Still, the rose petal in her notebook felt oddly heavy, as though carrying the weight of something unseen. By the time she reached the village, the afternoon sun had softened, and the scent of salt and roses mingled in the air. She walked past the post office, where the clerk gave her a perfunctory nod, and back toward the inn. The quiet that had seemed peaceful yesterday now felt watchful. Inside the Blue Gull, Mrs. Catamole was setting the table for tea. "Out for a stroll again, dearie? You do like our cliffs." "They're irresistible," said Tuppence, removing her gloves. "I met Mrs. North today. Remarkable woman." The teapot lid clattered faintly against its rim. "Oh, did you now?" "Yes." She seemed surprised to see me. Mrs. Catamole's hands fidgeted. "Best leave her be, dearie. That house is nothing but sorrow." Tuppence smiled gently. "Sometimes sorrow hides company." That night, long after the lamps were extinguished, she sat by her window overlooking the sea. The water below was silver with moonlight, restless and full of whispers. And high above, the single lamp in Mrs. North's window burned steadily on, as if keeping watch for something that refused to stay buried. The church bell at Seaford had a voice of its own, cheerful, self-important, and faintly cracked, like an elderly gossip announcing she still knew everything worth knowing. Tuppence followed the sound that morning, umbrella in hand, though the day was fair because she'd already discovered that no investigation prospered without at least one encounter over tea with the vicar's wife. The vicarage was a tidy stone house with ivy clinging to its sides and a gate that squeaked like a confidant. The front garden brimmed with the sort of flowers that looked perpetually surprised to find themselves thriving. A cat lay sprawled on the step, stretching luxuriously before darting off as she approached. Before she could knock, the door opened and a smiling woman of generous proportions appeared, flower dust on her cuffs and good humour in her eyes. "Mrs. Beresford, how perfectly delightful! Do come in. I was just setting the kettle." "Mrs. Lovelace, I presume?" "Indeed, and you've caught me between the vicar and the organist, which is probably the safest moment of the week. Tea or coffee?" "No, don't answer. I can tell you're a tea woman." Tuppence laughed, surrendering to the inevitable. "I find tea the only beverage suited to both consolation and interrogation." "Then we shall get along famously," Mrs. Lovelace said, leading her into a sunny sitting room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and sermon paper. "Now, what brings you to our little corner of the coast? Not relatives, I hope. Everyone's already related to everyone else here, which makes conversation tricky." "I'm visiting for a few days," said Tuppence smoothly, "taking in the air, the scenery, and perhaps the local history. I'm something of a collector of stories." "Stories," Mrs. Lovelace's eyes lit up. "You'll find more of those than pebbles on the beach. Do sit down, my dear." The tea appeared with ecclesiastical promptness, delicate china, scones dense enough to double as weapons, and strawberry jam served with missionary zeal. "I must warn you," said Mrs. Lovelace, pouring, "I'm quite incapable of discussing history without digressing into scandal." "That's the only kind worth preserving," said Tuppence. The vicar's wife beamed. "Well then, where to begin? The harvest fete, perhaps, poor Mr. Pickersgill and his unfortunate misunderstanding with the tombola prizes. Or the choir feud. Do you know, our organist once locked the tenors in the vestry during evensong." Tuppence expressed proper astonishment, though her attention sharpened when Mrs. Lovelace leaned forward conspiratorially. "Mind you, Seaford isn't all hymns and harmless gossip. We've had our tragedies too." "Oh?" Tuppence prompted gently. Mrs. Lovelace nodded, lowering her voice. "Mrs. North, up on the cliff. You must have heard. She was one of my most regular communicants, until the accident." Tuppence's hand paused halfway to her teacup. "Accident?" The vicar's wife blinked, then looked momentarily flustered. "Oh dear, perhaps I shouldn't have. Well, it was years ago now. Her sister, poor girl, drowned in a boating mishap. Quite dreadful. They were out near the rocks, and the boat exploded. Some fuel problem, I believe. Mrs. North never quite recovered. Rarely comes to services anymore." The words settled like pebbles in Tuppence's mind, fitting a space she hadn't known was waiting for them. She kept her tone light. "I met Mrs. North briefly yesterday. She seems rather composed, considering." Mrs. Lovelace sniffed delicately. "Composure can be armour, my dear. The whole village knows she carries guilt. She was meant to be on that boat herself, you see. Changed her mind at the last moment." "Ah," Tuppence set down her cup carefully. "And the sister, did she have family elsewhere?" "Not that I ever heard. There was a fiancé, perhaps, but he disappeared after the inquiry. Can't say I blame him. These seaside romances seldom end well." Tuppence allowed a small laugh, though her thoughts raced. A sister who drowned, a fiancé who vanished, and a photograph of the supposedly dead woman smiling from Mrs. North's mantelpiece. Mrs. Lovelace, mistaking her silence for tact, leaned forward again. "You won't mention any of this, of course. Mrs. North's been through enough. We all try to, well, let sleeping waves lie, as the vicar says." "Of course," said Tuppence. "I'm a model of discretion." The conversation drifted back to safer waters, bazaars, choir rosters, and whether lemon curd was morally superior to jam. Tuppence smiled and nodded, filing away each detail like a secretary with perfect shorthand. When at last she rose to leave, Mrs. Lovelace escorted her to the gate. "Do visit again. We're having a church sale next week, though heaven knows if anyone will buy the marmalade after last year's incident." "Scandal at the jam table?" Tuppence asked, amused. "Entirely theological. Someone switched the labels on the gooseberry." Tuppence laughed aloud. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The walk back to the Blue Gull was quiet. Afternoon sunlight stretched across the narrow street, glinting on bicycles and lace-curtained windows. Everything looked serenely ordinary, yet Tuppence felt the calm as something painted over deeper tension. The villagers' politeness now seemed like the hush that follows a secret being reburied. Inside the inn, the sitting room was empty. She called for Mrs. Cattermole, but heard only the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Mounting the stairs, she noticed the corridor smelled faintly of lavender and dust, unchanged, and yet... Her door stood slightly ajar. She froze. She was certain she'd locked it that morning. The brass key still hung from her wrist on its ribbon, as it always did. Pushing the door open, she scanned the room quickly. Nothing looked immediately disturbed, yet something in the air was wrong. The curtains were drawn too evenly, the bedspread smoothed too carefully. She crossed to her travel case and saw that the latch was unfastened. Inside, her belongings were precisely arranged. Too precisely. Someone had searched but tidied afterward, the way only professionals, or very nervous amateurs, ever did. She went to the dresser. One drawer was open by an inch. She pulled it out fully. Her notebook, the one containing her observations about Mrs. North, lay exactly where she'd left it, except for one detail. The rose petal she'd pressed inside was gone. Tuppence closed the drawer quietly. "Curious," she murmured. "Either Mrs. Cattermole's housekeeping is overly devoted, or I've acquired an admirer with odd taste in souvenirs." She checked the lock again. No scratches, no marks. Whoever had entered had a key. The door to the adjoining room creaked faintly, though she knew no guest was staying there this week. She stood very still, listening. Nothing. Only the muted thrum of the sea below the cliffs and the distant rattle of crockery. At last she exhaled and smiled thinly. "Well, my friend, if you wanted to confirm that I'm alone, consider the answer yes, but you'll find that's rarely the same as unguarded." She sat at the small writing desk by the window and drew out a fresh sheet of paper. The pen scratched across it, the rhythm soothing. "My dearest Tommy, you will be annoyed, but only slightly, I hope, to learn that I am investigating something entirely without you. I promise it involves no Germans, no revolvers, and almost certainly no international incidents. There's a house on the cliff, a widow with 2 perfect roses, and a sister who may not be as drowned as reported. If this letter reaches you, you may assume I've become inconveniently correct." She stopped there, tapping the pen against her chin. Sending it now would be melodramatic, and perhaps foolish. Whatever game was being played in Seaford, it was still in motion, and premature warnings might tip the balance. Instead, she folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and tucked it beneath the lining of her suitcase. "Just in case," she murmured. Outside, the tide shifted, its voice faint through the glass. Somewhere down the hallway, a floorboard creaked again, too slow and deliberate to be the house settling. Tuppence smiled without mirth, her eyes narrowing. "If you want a game," she whispered into the quiet, "you've found the right opponent." She rose, locked the door this time with an audible click, and drew the curtains wide. The sea was calm and glittering, the village deceptively peaceful. Yet beneath that calm, Tuppence could feel it, the same sensation she always felt before a revelation. Someone in Seaford was watching, and now they knew she was watching back. The clock on the stairwell struck 9 with the mournful deliberation of a judge passing sentence. Downstairs, the fire in the Blue Gull's sitting room had burned low, leaving the air tinged with the faint scent of ash and damp coal. Tuppence sat by the window, pretending to read an outdated copy of The Lady, though her attention was fixed on the flicker of lamplight in the corridor. She was waiting for the girl to come. Elsie had been nervous all day. At breakfast, she'd barely met Tuppence's eye. By supper, she'd looked pale enough to pass for one of the ghosts she'd hinted about. But when Tuppence had quietly suggested a little talk after the others have gone up, the maid had nodded once, quick and frightened. Now the inn was quiet except for the creak of old wood and the sigh of the sea below the cliff. Somewhere a window rattled. Tuppence folded her magazine and listened. Soft footsteps, hesitant and light. Then a timid knock. "Come in," said Tuppence gently. Elsie slipped inside, shutting the door behind her with care. Her cap was askew, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. "I shouldn't be here, Mum," she whispered. "Mrs. Cattermole doesn't like the help talking too much." "Then we'll make it quick," Tuppence replied. "Sit down, Elsie. No one's the wiser." The girl perched on the edge of the chair, twisting her fingers. "You asked me about Mrs. North," she began in a rush. "I worked there 2 years back before coming here. Thought it'd be grand, fine house, good wages. But I left sudden, and folks said I made it up, only I didn't." "Made what up?" Elsie glanced at the door, then leaned closer. "The noises. In the east wing, the part that faces the sea." Tuppence's expression was mild, but her eyes sharpened. "Go on." "There's a corridor there, all locked now. The mistress said it was because of damp, but it weren't damp I heard. It was crying, Mum. Soft, like someone who'd been crying a long time and couldn't stop. First I thought it was wind in the chimney, but then—" She swallowed. "Then I saw her." Tuppence leaned forward slightly. "You saw whom?" "The drowned lady." The words came out in a shudder. "I was dusting the stair rail one evening when I looked up, and there she was, standing in the window of the east room, white as chalk, her hair all down, looking straight out to sea. And, Ma'am, she had the same face as the photograph in the drawing room. The sister, the one who died." Tuppence kept her voice steady. "And you told Mrs. North this?" "I told Mrs. Webb, the housekeeper. She near boxed my ears off. Said if I wanted to keep my place, I'd hold my tongue. Next morning I was sent packing, said I'd made mischief." "Did you ever tell anyone else?" Elsie shook her head. "Who'd believe me? They all said I imagined it. But I know what I saw. She was alive." The air in the room felt heavier. Tuppence studied the girl, the nervous flutter of her hands, the sincerity in her frightened eyes. There was no guile there, only the memory of something she couldn't unsee. "Elsie," Tuppence said softly, "you've done the right thing telling me. But you must be careful. Some people don't like questions." The girl's gaze darted to the door again. "I know. That's why I came tonight. I couldn't keep it in any longer. But if Mrs. Cattermole finds out—" "She won't," said Tuppence firmly, "and I promise I'll look into it." Elsie hesitated, then whispered, "There's something else. I saw a man there too, not one of the servants. He came by late sometimes when the tide was high, always through the side gate like he didn't want to be seen." A man? Tall, dark coat. He'd go up the back stair, straight to the east wing. Once I heard him arguing with Mrs. North. Couldn't make out words, but she sounded desperate. Next morning she was in bed, white as a sheet, and Mrs. Webb said she'd been taken ill. But I don't think it was illness, Mum. I think it was fear. Before Tuppence could question further, there came the sound of footsteps in the corridor. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to be Mrs. Cattermole's. Both women froze. The steps paused outside the door. Tuppence rose, gesturing for Elsie to stay silent. She crossed to the lamp, turning it down so the room fell into a hush of half-light. The footsteps shifted again, closer, then stopped completely. For a moment, the inn held its breath. Then, without warning, the hallway lamp outside their door went out. Elsie stifled a gasp. "Oh, Lord," she whispered. Tuppence straightened, her voice calm but carrying. "Who's there?" No reply. She moved toward the door, every sense alive. The handle did not move. She waited another moment, then flung it open. The corridor beyond was empty, the single extinguished lamp still smoking faintly. She turned back to Elsie. "See? Just a trick of the wind. Someone brushed the lamp, perhaps." But the reassurance was for the girl's sake, not her own. "I'd best go," Elsie said hurriedly, already halfway to the door. "If anyone sees me—" Tuppence nodded. "All right. But Elsie, be careful. And if anything happens, if you're frightened again, you come straight to me." "Yes, Ma'am." The girl vanished down the passage, her footsteps fading toward the back stair. Tuppence waited, listening until silence resumed its hold. She shut the door, turned the lamp back up, and stood there a moment, considering. A drowned woman seen alive, a locked wing, a frightened maid, and now a silent watcher in the hall. The pattern was taking shape, faint but unmistakable. "Whoever you are," she murmured, "you've just confirmed I'm getting close." By morning, the inn was full of its usual domestic sounds, clinking crockery, murmured greetings, the soft bustle of seaside routine. The night's unease felt almost imaginary in the daylight. Almost. When Tuppence came down for breakfast, Mrs. Cattermole greeted her with forced brightness. "Lovely morning, dearie. Sleep well?" "Like a cat in a curiosity shop," said Tuppence. "Where's Elsie this morning?" "Elsie?" The landlady blinked too quickly. "Oh, she's gone off to visit family. Sudden-like. Got a note first thing asking her to come. You know how it is." Tuppence buttered her toast with deliberate calm. How thoughtful of her family to write so early. I didn't hear the post. Mrs. Cattermole flushed. "Messenger boy brought it." "Ah," Tuppence smiled thinly. "One never keeps track of these helpful boys." The landlady busied herself with the teapot, avoiding her gaze. "She'll be back in a week, I dare say." "I dare say," echoed Tuppence. When Mrs. Cattermole retreated to the kitchen, Tuppence let the smile fade. She rose, crossed to the hallway and glanced toward the rear door. The mat bore faint marks, muddy footprints that hadn't yet dried, smaller than a man's, not quite matching Elsie's sensible shoes. Someone had come and gone early, perhaps very early. She bent, touching one, damp still. "No messenger boy," she murmured. "Just a message." Returning upstairs, she found her suitcase exactly where she'd left it, but she checked inside all the same. The letter to Tommy was untouched. The petal, however, was still gone. Standing by the window, she looked out toward the sea. The tide was retreating, revealing black rocks slick with foam. A gull perched on the rail, cawing harshly into the wind. Elsie's words replayed in her mind. I saw her, standing in the window. She was alive. Alive. The same word as the letter that had summoned her here. Coincidence? Hardly. Someone was keeping a woman hidden in that cliff house, and someone else was desperate to ensure no one believed it. And now, a frightened maid had vanished overnight. Tuppence folded her arms, tapping one gloved finger against the sill. The time for polite inquiry was past. "I think, Mrs. North," she said softly to the horizon, "it's time we spoke again, without the niceties." But she would not rush in blind. Not yet. There were still pieces missing. A motive, a link, perhaps a witness too afraid to speak. She crossed to the writing desk and took out another sheet of paper. This time the letter she began was brief and practical. "Tommy, darling, I've stumbled upon something odd in Seaford. You may laugh, but I believe one of your old cases has resurfaced. Quite literally. If you don't hear from me in 3 days, assume I've been dreadfully right." She stopped there. After a pause, she tore the letter neatly in half. "No," she decided aloud. "Not yet. Not until I have proof." She tucked the torn pieces into her handbag, picked up her hat, and glanced once more toward the cliff path rising beyond the village. The sun had broken through the clouds, but its brightness did nothing to ease the chill in her thoughts. Elsie had known too much, and now she was gone. The sea might have taken her, or someone else might have ensured she disappeared more quietly. Either way, the message was clear enough. Tuppence straightened her shoulders and smiled a little grimly. "I do hope," she said to the empty room, "they've underestimated me. People often do." She locked the door behind her and went out into the morning, the salt air sharp with secrets. The gulls wheeled overhead, indifferent witnesses to whatever the sea kept, and whatever it would soon return. If curiosity killed the cat, Tuppence Beresford reflected, she'd used up at least 8 of her 9 lives by now. But the 9th was worth risking, especially when someone in Seaford was doing such a determined job of keeping her from the truth. The morning came bright and deceptive, with that crisp clarity seaside air always has when danger is brewing. From her window at the Blue Gull, Tuppence could see the distant shimmer of Cliff House against the blue-grey horizon. She'd decided to walk the path again, purely for exercise, as she'd told Mrs. Cattermole over breakfast. Mrs. Cattermole had murmured something about unstable ground, and nearly dropped the marmalade. That had settled it. The cliff path began just beyond the last row of cottages, winding upward between brambles and tufts of heather. Gulls wheeled overhead, shrieking like disapproving parishioners. Tuppence's heels crunched over gravel as she paused now and then to admire the sea, or rather, to appear to admire it. Her eyes were on the garden beyond the fence ahead, where she'd seen movement. Someone was there, bending among the rose bushes that bordered Mrs. North's property. The man straightened as she approached, not a labourer by any honest measure. His clothes were serviceable but well cut, his boots new, and his hands, when he brushed dirt from them, were too smooth for spade work. His face was long, pale, and set in an expression that tried to be disinterested, but fell short. "Morning," Tuppence called cheerfully. "You're making heroic progress. I was admiring the roses from the lane." He turned, tugging off his cap. "Thank you, miss. They take some keeping." "Do they? I'd no idea. Mine usually surrender without a fight." He gave a short laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, that's because you've got London roses, I dare say. Spoilt by the soot." "Indeed. You're local, then?" He hesitated, a blink too long. "Been here a year or so. Name's Bligh. Gardener for the house." Tuppence tilted her head. "Mrs. North's gardener?" "That's right." He stooped again, cutting a few leaves that didn't need trimming. "Hard soil here. Salt air kills most things. These roses, though, they've got grit." "How admirable. I should like to think I share their temperament." His mouth twitched, uncertain whether she was teasing. Aye, perhaps. She watched him for a moment, her mind working faster than her tongue. His voice wasn't local either. There was a trace of London in it, rough edges sanded down by effort, but unmistakable. His shoes, too clean for fieldwork, were damp only at the soles. A man used to walking pavements, not gardens. "Such a lovely view," she said airily. "You must find it inspiring, all that sea and sky." He straightened again, following her gaze toward the water. For the briefest instant, something flickered in his expression, not admiration but anxiety. His eyes swept the horizon as if expecting something to surface. "Beautiful enough," he said finally. "But it's treacherous, that sea. Swallows things whole. Boats, people, secrets." "A poetic gardener," Tuppence exclaimed. "How refreshing." He gave a half smile. "Not poetry, ma'am. Experience." The word hung there between them, faintly chilling. She decided to change tack. "I heard there was once a tragedy connected with this place. Mrs. North's sister, wasn't it?" His reaction was subtle, but not subtle enough. The shears in his hand paused mid-air. "That was before my time," he said flatly. "I see. Still, how dreadful. I suppose Mrs. North doesn't talk of it." He met her eyes then, sharp and direct. "No, ma'am. And it'd be best if others didn't either." Tuppence smiled sweetly. "An admirable sentiment, Mr. Bligh. You're quite protective of your employer." I'm paid to look after the grounds, he said, turning back to his roses. Of course, one must tend the soil if one wants to keep the roots hidden. She left him to puzzle that one out, continuing along the path. But when she reached the bend overlooking the beach, she paused and glanced back. Bligh was no longer trimming roses. He was standing quite still, watching her go, the shears dangling at his side. When he realized she'd turned, he bent quickly, pretending to snip at the nearest branch. Tuppence smiled to herself. Not much of a gardener after all. She returned to the village by way of the harbour, where fishermen were mending nets in a lazy rhythm of sun and salt. One of them, a burly man with windburned cheeks, nodded to her. "Morning, miss. Bit far up the cliffs for a stroll, weren't you?" "I'm a reckless tourist," she said. "I met your neighbour, the gardener from Cliff House, Mr. Bligh." The man squinted. "Bligh, you said?" "Yes. Tall, fairish hair, looks like he polishes his boots twice a day." The fisherman grunted. "That's no gardener. I've seen him before down at the quay 2 summers back. There was a salvage inquiry then, after that yacht blew up off the point. Big to-do it was." Tuppence's heart gave a small, satisfied leap. "Salvage inquiry?" "Aye. Boat called the Morwenna. Belonged to some city gent. Had a lady aboard too. Never found her. He was one of the men brought in to give evidence. Said he'd been nearby in another vessel helping with the rescue. Looked more like he was helping himself to something, if you ask me." "Interesting," said Tuppence lightly, though her mind was racing. "Didn't stay long, I suppose. Vanished right after the inquest. Can't say anyone missed him." She thanked him, dropped a coin in the collection tin by his feet, and walked on toward the quay. A salvage inquiry, a woman lost at sea, a man named Bligh who reappears years later at the house of that woman's grieving sister, and a gardener who watches the waves as though afraid of what they might give back. By late afternoon she'd climbed the cliff path again, notebook in hand, pretending to sketch the coastline. She had the uneasy sense that the landscape was watching her as much as she was studying it. The dark smear of seaweed on the rocks below, the gulls circling above like pale fragments of suspicion. The path narrowed near the bend where the land dropped steeply toward the cove. She crouched to examine something glinting in the soil, a scrap of metal half buried among the roots of a gorse bush. Carefully, she pried it loose. It was a cigarette case, tarnished, rusted at the hinges, and dented as though it had been thrown or crushed. When she rubbed away the dirt, faint initials emerged on the lid. M.D. Edward Dane. The name from Tommy's old case file, Margaret Dane's fiancé, the man ruined by scandal after the yacht explosion. Supposedly he'd fled abroad after the inquiry, but here was his cigarette case, half buried on the cliffs below Mrs. North's garden. Tuppence's fingers tightened around it. The metal was cold, heavy, and oddly intimate, like holding a whisper from the past. She rose slowly, scanning the path. The sea boomed far below, the sound deep and rhythmic. In the distance she could see Bligh again near the gate, his figure framed against the rose bushes. He was watching her. "Not very subtle, my friend," she murmured. She slipped the cigarette case into her coat pocket and turned back toward the village, walking briskly but without haste. The wind tugged at her hat, carrying the salt smell of the tide and something fainter, the scent of roses, drifting down from the cliff. Mrs. Cattermole was waiting in the inn's hallway when Tuppence returned. Her face wore the fixed smile of someone who's been dying to ask a question, but too polite to admit it. "Out walking again, dearie? You'll wear out your shoes." "They're old friends. They know what I'm about," Tuppence said lightly. Mrs. Cattermole hesitated. "You didn't happen to see our gardener up there, did you?" "Our gardener?" "The one from the North Place, Mr. Bligh. He was asking about you this morning. Said you dropped something yesterday near the fence." "How thoughtful of him. I do hope he found it," said Tuppence, removing her gloves, "though I can't think what it might have been." The landlady fussed with her apron. "Best to keep to the lower path, dearie. The cliffs crumble something awful this time of year." Tuppence smiled. "I'm not afraid of falling, Mrs. Cattermole. I'm more worried about what's already fallen, and who helped it along." Mrs. Cattermole paled. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course not," said Tuppence pleasantly. "Neither do I. Yet." That evening, as twilight softened the sky, she sat at her desk with the cigarette case open before her. Inside, despite the corrosion, was a trace of something, fine sand and the ghost of a faint perfume. The engraving, though worn, was clear enough to confirm what she already knew. MD to MD. With all that I am, a gift from Edward to Margaret Dane. The drowned sister, the one who was supposed to be dead. Tuppence traced the letters with her fingertip. So, Edward, you didn't go abroad after all. You stayed close, but were you guarding her or burying her twice? She closed the case and slipped it into her handbag, locking it inside. A knock at the door startled her. She turned sharply. Mrs. Cattermole's voice floated through, a touch too sweet. "Just seeing if you wanted supper brought up, dearie." "No, thank you. I've had enough excitement for one day." Footsteps retreated. Silence settled again. Tuppence went to the window. The lamp in Mrs. North's house was burning, just one light, high in the east wing. And there, a shadow passed across it, the outline of a man. "Mr. Bligh," she murmured, "our so-called gardener." The pieces were falling into place, but not neatly. A hidden sister, a false servant, a secret worth killing for. She drew the curtains and turned down the lamp, her heart steady but her mind afire. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would go back to Cliff House, not as a visitor, but as a trespasser. Whatever lay behind those locked doors in the east wing, it was time someone stopped pretending it didn't exist. And if the sea had swallowed the truth once, Tuppence intended to make it give it back. It began with the quiet scratch of paper against wood, that small, unmistakable sound of something being slipped under a door. Tuppence, seated at her writing desk with her notebook and a pot of cooling tea, froze mid-sentence. The clock on the mantel ticked on, indifferent to intrusion. She rose, crossed the room softly, and looked down. A folded note lay against the threshold. For a moment, she simply regarded it, lips pursed. One didn't reach her age and remain married to Tommy Beresford without developing a healthy respect for anonymous communications. She bent, picked it up, and unfolded it. The handwriting was quick and angular, written in black ink pressed too hard into the paper. "Leave before Friday. You're not the first to ask about her." There was no signature. Tuppence stared at the words, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled, not pleasantly, but with that particular glint Tommy had once called her cat about to pounce look. "Charming," she murmured. "But whoever you are, my dear, you've underestimated my stubbornness." She refolded the note neatly, slipped it into her pocket and sat back down. The sensible course would have been to take the next train to London, write a long letter to Tommy beginning with, "You'll never believe what nearly happened," and forget all about Seaford. But curiosity was already running its fingers through her mind, rearranging everything. By the next morning, her course was decided. The post office sat at the corner of the square, a modest building that smelled of ink, sealing wax, and the faint despair of unposted letters. Behind the counter sat Miss Priddy, a tall, angular woman whose hair was pulled so tight it seemed to hold her upright. "Morning," Tuppence said, in her best version of amiable nosiness. "I wonder if you could help me with a small inquiry. I'm writing an article about coastal communications." Miss Priddy gave her a look that suggested she doubted the existence of such an article, but she didn't object. "We've the same wires as anywhere else, madam. Not much call for them unless someone's ill or the weather's gone bad." "Indeed. I was told that Mrs. North occasionally sends or receives telegrams from here, the lady who lives up on the cliff." The woman's hands paused over a ledger. "Mrs. North?" "Yes, very gracious woman. I was there just the other day." Miss Priddy pursed her lips. "She does send messages now and again. Nothing scandalous in that." "Oh, heavens, no. I was merely curious. Journalism, you see. Accuracy over gossip." Miss Priddy's disapproval softened slightly at the word accuracy. "Well, she's had the odd telegram, yes. From London, always signed the same." "Really?" "M.D." Tuppence's pen, which she had been using to doodle aimlessly on her notepad, stopped mid-scratch. "M.D.," she repeated. "That's right. Same initials every time. She sends replies too, short ones. We don't get the contents, of course, privacy of the post and all that, but she always looks a bit upset after." "Do you know who M.D. is?" "Not my business to know," said Miss Priddy primly. "But I'll tell you this. Once a gentleman came to collect one of the telegrams himself. Claimed Mrs. North had authorised him. Smartly dressed, tall, with a London look about him." Tuppence smiled faintly. "Would you say a gardener's tan?" "Hardly. He had hands like a clerk, not a spade man." That clinched it. Mr. Bligh, or whatever his name really was, and MD were one and the same. She thanked Miss Priddy, purchased 2 stamps she didn't need, and stepped back into the sunlight. Her pulse was quick, her mind briskly sorting through connections. MD, a familiar pair of initials. Tommy had mentioned them once in connection with an old case. Charles Dane, alias Crispin Day, a con artist whose career had been marked by charm, forgery, and broken hearts. He'd vanished after the Morwenna yacht explosion, the very one that had supposedly killed Margaret Dane. And now his name, or at least his initials, had reappeared in Seaford, attached to Mrs. North. If Tuppence had ever doubted she was onto something real, that doubt was gone. She returned to the Blue Gull shortly after noon. The inn was quiet. Most of the guests had gone walking or taken the train back to town. The hall smelled faintly of fried fish and polish. As she reached her room, she stopped dead. The door was ajar. Not wide, but just enough that the latch hadn't caught. She distinctly remembered locking it that morning, a habit she'd acquired after Elsie's disappearance. She pushed it open, cautiously. The curtains stirred in a faint breeze from the half-open window. Everything looked as she'd left it, almost too perfectly so. Her suitcase stood closed, her hat was still on its stand, her papers neatly arranged on the desk. Only one thing was missing. The note. The one that had been slid under her door. She checked the drawer where she'd hidden it. Empty. The drawer itself had been relined, the papers within rearranged with unsettling precision. Someone had keys. Someone had been here before. For a moment, Tuppence stood very still. She could hear the faint clink of teacups downstairs, Mrs. Cattermole's cheerful voice greeting someone at the door. Ordinary life went on, indifferent to intrusion. "Well," she said aloud, her tone light but her eyes cold, "if one must be burgled, it's at least flattering to be worth burgling." She crossed to the window, looking out toward the cliffs. The sea was calm, blue, almost pretty, which made it more dangerous in her experience. Far in the distance, she could see Cliff House, its pale facade gleaming under the afternoon sun. The east wing was shuttered, except for one small upper window. Her mind raced. Someone didn't want her asking questions. But who? Mrs. North, desperate to protect her secret. Bligh, the imposter gardener. Or another hand altogether. Someone orchestrating it all from London, signing each telegram MD. She sat down, trying to think clearly. Tommy would have handled it differently, called in the police perhaps, or at least demanded stronger tea. But she knew how he would scold her if he saw her now, snooping about on her own. Tuppence smiled to herself. "If Tommy could see me now," she said softly, "he'd send for Scotland Yard, and a chaperone." Her laughter was short-lived. A faint noise interrupted her amusement, the softest of metallic clicks, somewhere down the corridor. She rose again, moving to the door. The corridor was empty, lined with faded prints of ships and storms. One of the floorboards creaked under her foot. "Mrs. Cattermole?" she called lightly. No answer. She closed the door again and leaned against it, her heartbeat steady but elevated. Whoever had been there wasn't far away. They'd wanted her to know they could come and go as they pleased. "Well," she murmured, "thank you for the courtesy call." She turned the key in the lock and drew the bolt for good measure. Then, after a long moment of hesitation, she poured herself a small brandy from the decanter Mrs. Cattermole had left for nerves and took a slow sip. The warmth steadied her, but her mind refused to rest. She kept seeing those initials, MD, a ghost from Tommy's past, possibly resurrected, and Mrs. North, pale and trembling, keeping a vigil in that shuttered house on the cliffs. Her gaze drifted again toward the sea outside the window. The tide was coming in now, frothing white against the rocks. The light was fading fast, that thin, brittle twilight peculiar to coastal evenings. And then, as she watched, a flicker of light appeared on the far headland. 1, 2, pause, 1. It came from the east wing of Cliff House. Tuppence leaned forward, eyes narrowing. It wasn't the steady glow of a lamp. It was a pulse, rhythmic, deliberate, a signal. "Ah," she whispered, "so that's how you communicate, is it? Telegraphs from London and lights by the sea." The light vanished as abruptly as it had come. The cliff returned to shadow, its outline sharp against the dimming sky. Tuppence sat back slowly, the chill of realization settling over her. She had wanted proof that something secret was happening between Mrs. North and her so-called gardener. She had it now, though not yet the reason. The missing note, the vanished maid, the initials from the past, all threads weaving toward that single house, that silent east wing where the drowned sister might not be drowned after all. She looked down at her hands, steady but cold. "All right," she murmured. "If you won't bring me the truth, I'll come and fetch it myself." She crossed to the dresser, opened her handbag, and slipped in her notebook, a torch, and the small revolver Tommy insisted she carry for occasions of idiotic bravery. She hesitated a moment longer, then checked her reflection in the mirror. Her expression was composed, even amused. "Leave before Friday," she said, quoting the note softly. "I think not. Friday sounds like an excellent day to stay." Outside, the last light drained from the sea. The gulls had gone silent. Somewhere far off a door closed, perhaps at the inn, perhaps at the cliff house. Tuppence extinguished her lamp and stood by the window once more. The horizon was black now, but she fancied she could still feel that unseen pulse of light, faint, insistent, like a heartbeat in the dark. The first rule of detective work, Tuppence reflected as she stood in the dark lane outside the Blue Gull, was to look as though you belonged, especially when you didn't. The second was to bring a torch with fresh batteries. Unfortunately, she'd forgotten to test hers until halfway down the cliff path. Now, wrapped in a borrowed fisherman's cloak and clutching a flickering light, she looked like the world's least convincing smuggler. But that, she thought grimly, was still preferable to being dead, or married to a man who had faked his own wife's drowning. The night was calm, eerily so. The sea below murmured in long, steady breaths, brushing against the rocks like something patient and waiting. Ahead, the silhouette of Cliff House rose against the sky, sharp-roofed, aloof, and faintly luminous from a single window in the east wing. That was her destination. She slipped through the side gate, unlocked, though it squeaked protest at her passage, and crept along the gravel path. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a night bird gave a startled cry. Her torch beam quivered over the rose beds, now stripped of bloom but thick with thorns. She wondered idly whether Bly pruned them for beauty or concealment. A faint sound drifted through the stillness. Music. A piano. Soft, hesitant notes, like a memory trying to find its melody again. The tune faltered, stopped, and began anew. Tuppence's heartbeat quickened. No one had mentioned that Mrs. North played. Perhaps she didn't. She crossed to the French doors at the rear of the house. The curtains within glowed faintly from lamplight. When she tried the handle, it turned easily. The door opened with a whisper. Inside, the drawing room smelled of old roses and something medicinal. The furniture was draped in covers. The air carried the stillness of rooms uninhabited, but not abandoned. Somewhere deeper in the house, the piano played on. 2 bars repeated, hesitant, almost pleading. She moved toward the sound, her shoes making no more noise than breath on the carpet. The music came from the far end of a corridor. She followed it, her light darting across gilt frames and closed doors, until it fell on one door slightly ajar. The piano stopped. She hesitated, listening. Then came the faint scrape of a stool being pushed back and a sigh, low and exhausted. Tuppence stepped forward. "Mrs. North?" Silence. She pushed the door open. The room beyond was large and dim, its single lamp shaded in blue. A piano stood by the window, keys half covered. A sheet of music lay open, Liebestraum. The air smelled faintly of lavender and sea salt. And then, from the corner, came a whisper. "Who are you?" Tuppence turned. A figure stood by the far curtain, pale and trembling, dressed in a faded dressing gown. Her hair, once fair, now streaked with silver, framed a face that might have belonged to the photograph on Mrs. North's mantelpiece. Tuppence's breath caught. "You're Margaret Dane." The woman flinched. "Don't say that name." "You're supposed to be dead." Margaret gave a small, wild laugh. "So I've been told. It's easier that way." For a moment they stood in silence, the candlelight wavering between them. Then Tuppence moved closer, lowering her voice. "I came because I received a letter, unsigned, desperate. It said, 'She's alive.' I see now it was true." Margaret's eyes darted toward the door. "You must leave. If he finds you here, he being Mr. Bligh, I presume, or should I say M.D.? At the initials she gasped. You know about him. I know he's not a gardener, and that he once went by another name. Charles Dane, your husband. Her shoulders sagged. Yes, my husband, my ruin. Tuppence waited. She'd learned long ago that silence was often the best invitation. Margaret sank onto the piano stool, her hands twisting in her lap. It was an accident at first, the explosion on the yacht. He'd been living beyond his means, forging papers, borrowing money he could never repay. When the engine caught fire, he saw his chance. He jumped, left me for dead, and disappeared. But you survived. Barely. The current carried me to shore. A fisherman found me days later, half conscious. My sister took me in and swore no one would ever know. The scandal would have destroyed what was left of our name. She told everyone I'd drowned. I let her. Her voice trembled. We thought he'd gone for good, but he came back, 2 years later. Said he'd made a fortune abroad, that he wanted me to stay hidden, that it was safer if the world believed I was gone. Then the threats began. He wanted money, letters, jewels, anything my sister could give. When she refused, he sent men to frighten her, to frighten me. Tuppence's pulse quickened. And you've been living here ever since, in this wing? She nodded. He visits at night, pretends to be a servant when anyone asks. I hear him speaking with my sister, promising to keep the secret if she pays. But he's changed. There's something violent in him now. She's afraid. And you? Margaret smiled faintly. I'm beyond fear. I just want it to end. Tuppence opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, a sharp gust rattled the window. The door behind them slammed shut with a force that extinguished her candle. They were plunged into darkness. Margaret gave a strangled cry. He's here! Quiet! Hissed Tuppence. She struck another match, her hands steady despite the hammering of her heart. The flame flared and revealed not a ghost, but a terrified woman clutching her own arm as though to stop it shaking. Go, Margaret whispered. Please. But footsteps were already echoing down the corridor, measured, deliberate, unmistakably male. Tuppence snatched the candle back to life and glanced around the room. There was nowhere to run, no second door, no balcony, only a narrow wardrobe and a linen press built into the wall. Quickly, she whispered, crossing to it. Hide me. Margaret hesitated only a moment before pulling the door open. Tuppence slipped inside, pressing herself against the shelves of folded sheets. Through a sliver of wood, she could see the room dimly lit by the candle she'd left on the piano. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A key turned in the lock. Then quietly, the door opened. Mr. Bligh, if that was still his name, stepped inside. He was dressed in dark clothes, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. He moved with the caution of a man accustomed to hiding things, bodies, truths, perhaps both. Margaret rose slowly, the picture of fragile dignity. You shouldn't be here, she said. I might say the same, my dear, he replied softly. You've been restless, playing the piano again. Someone might hear. I don't care anymore. He crossed to her in 3 strides, his voice tightening. You'll care if your sister stops paying. Do you think I enjoy this? Keeping you hidden like a madwoman. I'd have let you vanish properly if she'd had the sense to let me. But no, she wanted to protect you, so here we are. Tuppence held her breath. Margaret's voice was shaking. It's over, Charles. You've taken enough. Not yet, he said. 1 more payment and I'm gone. You'll never see me again. And if she refuses? There was a pause. Then his tone changed, colder, almost thoughtful. Then perhaps a tragedy on the cliffs. Widow too distraught after losing her sister twice. That's a headline people like to read. Tuppence's hand tightened around the edge of the linen shelf. She was ready to burst out, but reason checked her. She was unarmed, outnumbered, and very possibly trapped. Margaret whispered, You wouldn't dare. He smiled faintly. You never did understand what I'd dare. He turned toward the door, speaking low as if to himself. The lady's getting restless. We'll have to move her. And with that, he was gone, his footsteps receding down the hall. For a few seconds, neither woman moved. Then Margaret exhaled shakily. He'll be back. You must go now. Tuppence stepped out, face pale but determined. I'll go, but not far. Mrs. North needs to know everything, and your husband needs to be stopped. You can't involve the police. My sister has harboured a crime long enough. Don't worry, I'll be discreet. It's practically a hobby." She gave a reassuring smile, though her heart was pounding. "Lock this door behind me. And if he comes again, make noise, throw something. Let the whole village hear if you must." Margaret nodded weakly. "God bless you, whoever you are." "Tuppence Beresford," she said quietly. "And don't worry, Mrs. Dane. I'm rather good at inconvenient resurrections." The servant's stair was narrow and spiraled downward into shadow. Her candle sputtered, throwing grotesque shapes on the walls. Once, she thought she heard movement below. A door creaking open, a whisper carried upward. She paused, straining to listen. Nothing but the low moan of wind seeping through cracks. At the bottom, she found a small side door leading to the garden. She eased it open, stepping into the cool rush of sea air. Behind her, the house loomed silent, only one upper window faintly lit. She took the path toward the gate, her pace quickening. The tide was rising now, waves breaking harder against the cliff. She glanced back once and froze. A figure stood at the window of the east wing. Not Margaret. Taller, broader, watching her, Bly. For an instant their eyes met across the distance, then he turned away, and the light behind him went out. Tuppence exhaled, half in relief, half in grim amusement. "Well, Mr. Bly," she murmured, "the game's up. You just don't know it yet." She pulled the cloak tighter around her shoulders and began the descent toward the village. The sea's roar grew louder, echoing off the rocks. The path was slick with spray, and twice she nearly lost her footing. But she kept going, one hand clutching her torch, the other the small revolver in her pocket. By the time she reached the bottom, her breath came fast but steady. The inn's lights were distant pinpricks now, golden and safe. Behind her, Cliff House stood black against the sky, its secrets no longer silent, its ghosts very much alive. The telegram reached Tommy Beresford 2 days after it should have. It had been delayed by a careless clerk, a late train, and the usual benevolent conspiracy of fate that ensured Tuppence Beresford's adventures never unfolded according to plan. Tommy stood in his office at South Audley Street, holding the crumpled envelope, the words short and chilling. "Seaford in Kent. Trouble. She's alive. Come quickly. T." For a man usually content to move at the leisurely pace of a chess player, Tommy's reaction was uncharacteristically swift. He barked for Albert to pack a bag, telephoned Inspector Marriott at the yard, and caught the first train out of Charing Cross before the coffee on his desk had cooled. By the time he reached Seaford, the day had turned grey and irritable, as if the weather itself disapproved of his tardiness. The village looked deceptively peaceful, gulls wheeling over the harbour, smoke curling from chimneys, and locals going about their business with studied innocence. But the first person he met, the fisherman who helped him off the train cart, gave him a look that drained the blood from his face. "You're here about the lady, I reckon," the man said, doffing his cap. "What lady?" asked Tommy sharply. The fisherman scratched his beard. "Stranger in the village, stayed at the Blue Gull, went walking last night along the cliff path. Boat's gone too. Tide was high. They say she must have slipped." Tommy's voice was quiet. "You're sure?" "As sure as anyone can be. There's a shawl they found on the rocks. Nothing else." For a moment, Tommy said nothing. Then he smiled faintly, the sort of smile that made Albert once remark, "That's when the boss starts turning nasty." "She didn't slip," he said. "My wife doesn't do anything as ordinary as slipping." The Blue Gull had seen better days, and Mrs. Cattermole looked as if she regretted every one of them. When Tommy arrived, she fluttered toward him in a cloud of starch and contrition. "Oh, sir, I'm that sorry. Dreadful business. Poor lady, she was ever so nice. Always polite, though perhaps a little inquisitive." "I see," said Tommy mildly. "And when did you last see her?" "Yesterday evening. Said she fancied a walk before supper. She'd been quiet all day, writing letters. Then off she went, just as calm as you please." "She left a letter with you?" The landlady hesitated. "Why, no, sir, not that I know of." Tommy smiled thinly. "She sent one. To me." That seemed to unsettle her. She wrung her hands, avoiding his eyes. "Perhaps she posted it herself, sir. She often went to the post office." "Indeed?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. and perhaps someone didn't like the idea of what was in it. Mrs. Cattermole blinked, uncertain. "Oh, sir, surely you don't think—" "I think," said Tommy evenly, "that my wife came here for a reason, and that reason hasn't vanished with the tide." He spent the next hour questioning the villagers. Tuppence's name produced a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. The vicar's wife wrung her hands about poor Mrs. North's troubles. Miss Priddy at the post office admitted to telegrams from her MD in London, but clammed up the moment Tommy asked for details. By late afternoon, he'd pieced together fragments: the mysterious gardener, the vanished maid, and a foreign-looking man seen heading toward Cliff House the night before. When he reached the cliffs, the tide was already turning. The air tasted of salt and secrecy. Below, the sea frothed white against the rocks. Near the edge, something metallic caught his eye. He crouched, brushed away the sand, and lifted it. A cigarette case, tarnished, battered, but engraved with familiar initials. M.D. Tuppence's clue, left deliberately. He turned it over in his hand, a surge of relief warming him. "Clever girl," he murmured. "Always did have a flair for dramatics." A faint voice interrupted his thoughts. "Lost something, sir?" He looked up to find a fisherman watching him, a stooped man with sea-stained hands and the calm eyes of someone who'd seen too many secrets. "Possibly found something," Tommy replied, pocketing the case. "Tell me, you seen anyone about this morning, or last night?" The man nodded toward the cove below. "Saw a light in that old hut before dawn. Thought it was the lads mending nets, but when I looked again, it was gone. Tide's come right up since." Tommy followed the direction of his pointing hand. A hut crouched against the rocks, half hidden by seaweed and shadow. Smoke, faint but definite, drifted from its chimney. "Much obliged," said Tommy, already striding toward the path. Inside the hut, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and brine. A kettle sat on the coals, hissing softly, and on a makeshift bed of blankets near the wall someone stirred. "Tuppence," he said quietly. She blinked up at him, her face pale but composed. "Oh, you took your time." Relief washed through him so fast it came out as irritation. "Good Lord, woman, do you make a habit of faking your own disappearance? I've been interrogating every fishmonger in Kent." She sat up slowly, wincing. "I didn't fake anything. Someone tried to help me over the cliff. The fact I landed in a boat instead of the channel was sheer luck." "Luck," he said grimly, "and stubbornness. You couldn't drown properly if you tried." "That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." She smiled faintly, though there were dark shadows under her eyes. "I'm quite all right, Tommy. Bruised, damp and unrepentant. But you might fetch that kettle. I've been too tired to make tea." He obeyed automatically, because that was how their marriage worked. When he handed her the cup, she took a grateful sip and sighed. "Now," she said, businesslike, "I'll brief you, and you'll scold me afterward, but not before." He sat opposite her, listening as she recounted everything: the letter, the gardener's false identity, the terrified widow, and the revelation that the drowned sister was alive, hidden by blackmail and fear. By the time she finished, Tommy's face had gone from astonishment to cold resolve. "So, M.D. is Charles Dane, alive, nasty, and playing gardener. That explains the telegrams from London." "And the mysterious payments," Tuppence added. "He's been bleeding poor Mrs. North dry, threatening to expose the whole affair." He rose, pacing the narrow hut. "He must have discovered you'd spoken with Margaret, tried to get rid of you before you could interfere." "Quite possibly," she agreed. "But now we have a better opportunity. Mrs. North is hosting a charity dinner tomorrow evening. Dane will be there. He can't resist the chance to flaunt his control in public." Tommy turned back to her. "You mean to use the dinner as a trap?" "Precisely. You'll take the polite approach. I'll take the impolite one." He folded his arms. "And where exactly do I fit into this lunatic plan?" "You, darling, are to arrive punctually and play the role of respectable husband while I provoke a confession." "I see. And when he inevitably pulls a gun?" "Then you, being a gentleman, will wrest it from him heroically." He sighed, half exasperated, half admiring. "Remind me again why I married you." "Because I'm far more interesting than a desk job," she said sweetly. "And because, deep down, you enjoy it." He couldn't help but laugh, quietly, but with genuine affection. "You're incorrigible." "True. Now help me up. I need dry clothes and a strong cup of coffee before facing blackmailers." He extended a hand, pulling her to her feet. For a moment, they stood close, a rare pause in their perpetual race between danger and banter. "Tommy," she said softly, "I was rather glad to see you, you know." "I gathered," he replied, smiling. "You didn't faint, so it must be affection." "Or habit." They both laughed, the sound strange and small in the lonely hut, but it broke the tension beautifully. By late afternoon, the Beresfords were back at the inn. Mrs. Cattermole's astonishment at seeing Tuppence alive was worthy of a painting. "I thought, oh dear heavens, I thought—" "Yes," said Tuppence cheerfully. "So did everyone. Terribly inconvenient being mistaken for a corpse. The paperwork alone is dreadful." Tommy's dry glance silenced the landlady's protests. "We'll need a motor car tomorrow evening, Mrs. Cattermole. Something discreet. And perhaps you could send word to Mrs. North that my wife wishes to call." The woman swallowed. "You're going back up there?" "Oh yes," said Tuppence. "I never leave a story unfinished." When Mrs. Cattermole had retreated, Tommy turned to her with mock severity. "You realize we're inviting trouble, don't you?" "Inviting?" said Tuppence brightly. "We're hosting it." He shook his head, a smile tugging at his mouth. "You know, for a woman who's nearly been murdered twice in as many days, you're remarkably chipper." "Adrenaline," she said, "and the prospect of seeing you try to arrest someone in formal wear." He looked heavenward. "Saints preserve me from clever wives." "Too late," she said, taking his arm. "You married one." That night, as the tide receded and the moon rose over the sea, the two of them sat together by the window of their room, plotting, whispering, and occasionally bickering. Outside, Cliff House loomed dark against the horizon, its windows blank and watchful. Somewhere within, Charles Dane, alias Bligh, alias Blackmailer, was planning his next move. And in the small glow of the inn's lamplight, Tuppence Beresford smiled like a cat preparing to spring. The charity dinner at Cliff House ended with handcuffs and headlines. The morning after the arrest dawned with the quiet dignity of relief. The Cliff House, so long wrapped in secrecy, now stood open to sunlight. Curtains fluttered at its windows, and the scent of salt drifted in with the breeze. The staff moved softly, as if aware that they were no longer guarding mysteries but helping to restore a home. In the drawing room, the sisters sat together, two women who had spent too many years apart. No servants lingered, no curious neighbours intruded. Only the muted conversation of reconciliation carried faintly through the open window, rising and falling with the sea's eternal pulse. Mrs. North, her usual poise softened by exhaustion, reached for her sister's hand. "I thought I was saving you," she said quietly. "I see now I only made you a prisoner." Margaret's answer was tender. "You were saving what you could, both of us perhaps. We were all a little blind." There was a pause. The waves below sighed against the rocks as though agreeing. "You'll stay here now?" Mrs. North asked. "For a while," said Margaret. "Then perhaps London. I think I'd like to walk through a street without looking over my shoulder." Mrs. North smiled faintly. "You'll have to learn to live again." "So will you." They sat in silence a moment longer. Then Margaret rose and crossed to the window. "Listen," she said softly. "It sounds peaceful again." And for the first time in years it did. Down the drive, two figures walked at an unhurried pace toward the village, one tall and neat, the other brisk and irreverent. Tuppence had discarded her borrowed cloak and regained her customary air of composed mischief. Tommy, beside her, looked as though he was debating whether to admire her or throttle her, both emotions held firmly in check by long habit. "Well," said Tuppence, adjusting her hat, "I'd call that a thoroughly satisfactory conclusion. A house redeemed, a villain captured, a sister restored, and I wasn't even drowned." Tommy gave her a look. "You were nearly drowned." "Nearly doesn't count. It's the moral victory that matters." "The moral victory," he said dryly, "being that you managed to terrify every policeman from here to the coast and get yourself quoted in 3 local gossip columns." She smiled sweetly. "Publicity is good for the agency." "We don't have an agency," he reminded her. "We retired, remember?" She tilted her head. "Retirement is simply what one calls a lull between cases." He sighed. "I should have had that engraved on the wedding certificate." They walked a few more steps in companionable silence. The path curved along the headland, the sea glittering below like liquid glass. Gulls wheeled lazily overhead, their cries blending with the distant hum of the village. Finally, Tommy spoke again. "You could have been killed, Tuppence." "Yes," she said simply, "but then you'd have missed the climax." "That's not funny." "It's a little funny." He gave her a sidelong glance, lips twitching despite himself. "You're impossible." "And you," she replied, "are late. If you'd arrived half a day sooner, I might have avoided the scenic route to survival." Tommy stopped walking. "Half a day sooner, and you'd have refused to wait for me anyway." "True," she admitted cheerfully, "but it would have been nice to have the option." They resumed walking, laughter softening the edges of their bickering. The road sloped gently downward towards Seaford, where the inn's sign swung in the breeze. At the Blue Gull, Mrs. Cattermole greeted them with an effusive mixture of relief and curiosity. "Oh, Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, I never knew what to think. The whole village says you solved it all yourselves." "Pure exaggeration," said Tommy. "We merely assisted the local authorities in their duties." "And drank all my tea in the process," added Tuppence, setting her gloves on the counter. Mrs. Cattermole's eyes widened. "Will they be printing it in the papers, do you suppose?" "Almost certainly," said Tuppence, "though if they're kind they'll describe me as a sensible woman of firm character." Tommy groaned. "They'll describe you as a reckless amateur investigator with unusual luck." "Luck," she said grandly, "is simply preparation meeting opportunity." "Then your preparation must include defying gravity." "Don't be envious," she said. "You had the simpler role, heroic husband arriving just in time to scold me." He smiled. "Yes, and you gave me my cue beautifully." Before Mrs. Cattermole could comment further, the door rattled and Billy burst in, flushed from the telegraph office, waving a slip of paper like a banner. "Message for you, ma'am. Just came in from London." Tuppence took it, unfolding the telegram with theatrical slowness. "Congratulations on not getting drowned. Management relieved. Suggest early train before next disaster." She grinned. Tuppence took it, unfolding the telegram. "From Albert in London." Tommy chuckled. "Our loyal assistant. Always so encouraging." "Still," said Tuppence, "it's good advice. Shall we go home tomorrow?" He nodded. "The sooner the better. I could do with a week of ordinary meals and absolutely no mysteries." She pretended to think it over. Ordinary meals, yes, but no mysteries. We'd get bored in 3 days. "2," he said, "and you'd invent one." "Probably," she admitted. "But admit it, Tommy, you'd miss it too." He looked out the window at the sea, now calm and silver in the morning light. "Maybe I would, but next time I'd prefer fewer cliffs and more comfortable suspects." Tuppence laughed. "I'll see what I can do." That evening they dined by the fire, the village quieting around them. Outside, the tide whispered against the shore, steady and indifferent. The case of the North Sisters was already receding into memory, leaving behind only fragments, a rusted cigarette case, a broken piano string, and the faint echo of a woman's voice saying, "I'm not dead anymore." Tuppence leaned back, content. "Do you know, I rather liked Mrs. North," she said. "She had backbone. Even her guilt was dignified." Said Tommy. "A pity about her dinner service, though. The inspector broke 2 glasses arresting Dane." She laughed softly. "Every victory has casualties." He looked at her fondly. "You've a very odd idea of victory." "It's worked so far." They finished their meal in companionable silence. When the plates were cleared, Tuppence went to the window. The sea stretched out vast and gleaming, reflecting the moon like a secret it no longer needed to keep. She said, almost to herself, "Funny how quiet it feels now, as if the whole place has been holding its breath for years and has only just exhaled." Tommy joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "Peace can be very noisy once you notice it." "Do you suppose they'll be all right, the sisters?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, they've both earned a second chance. That's more than most get." A soft breeze lifted the curtains. Somewhere below, a wave broke gently against the rocks. Tuppence turned, mischief rekindling in her eyes. "When we get home, I'm going to have a sign made for your study door." "Oh?" "It will read, 'Detective Solo, do not disturb.'" Tommy groaned. "I'll never live that down." "You never do," she said cheerfully. "That's what makes it a partnership." Elsie returned 2 days later, shaken but safe, her silence bought and broken. They left Seaford the next morning, the car bumping gently along the cliff road. From the hilltop, the house was just a pale outline against the blue horizon, the windows catching the sunlight like winks of forgiveness. Below, the sea moved with unhurried grace. A single rose petal, perhaps fallen from Mrs. North's breakfast tray, perhaps from nowhere at all, drifted out on the tide, turning slowly in the water until it vanished beneath the waves. And if one stood there long enough, listening to the rhythm of the surf, it might have sounded like the sea was whispering, "All's well again."